Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this session right before lunch. My name is Alexis, and on behalf of myself and my co-author, Andalibi, I'll be presenting on regulating emotion AI in the United States context. So first, what is emotion artificial intelligence? So scholars have defined this type of AI as a type of AI that claims the ability to infer our subconscious feelings or emotions through assessing the patterns in a variety of data inputs. And so there are some problems generally with emotion AI that scholars have reflected on. One, it's technically inaccurate, scholars argue. And then there are some ethical and privacy implications with the idea of trying to infer subconscious feelings. But nonetheless, this has been deployed across contexts. So I'll just name a few here. It can be used to monitor how people are feeling while doing their work. It's been used in driving to see how people are feeling. And this is already a really large market that's expected to nearly double in the next 5 years. And policymakers have found this problematic in Europe. In Europe, there's been bans on emotion tracking in their AI rules. But in the US, this hasn't necessarily happened yet. And so a few years ago, legal scholar Jennifer Barr talked about how it is complicated to regulate emotion AI in the United States, given the lack of consensus that people have about what exactly emotion data is. And so this might mean, is emotion data health data? Is it manipulation? Should it be, like, how should it actually be defined? And so how can we regulate it? And so this paper wanted to understand how the US public thinks that regulators should conceptualize emotion data when regulating emotion AI. And then we also wanted to understand how the US public opinion might differ about banning emotion AI across different contexts of deployment. And I'll say here that we use the term banning not only because this is the framing that policymakers might look at when assessing or banning emotion AI, but also using a more vague term like regulate might have instigated different sorts of perceptions that were more vague than asking people about banning the technology. And so we didn't want to just see descriptively what people thought should be banned across different contexts. We wanted to know what shaped these perceptions. And so using the literature, and I'll just briefly mention these and happy to talk more later, but there is this concept of psychological ownership that has been debated and if it can exist over our data. And so we wanted to see, given the intimacy of emotion data, do people feel like they own this data and that it's theirs? And is this going to impact the way that they think it should be regulated? We also were curious about how people felt about the accuracy and bias of this technology, and if this would shape how they felt this might be regulated across contexts. And then finally, this paper asked who should be held responsible for emotion AI regulation. So we conducted a survey of a nationally representative sample from the United States, and we also oversampled for individuals with disabilities, people of color, and gender minorities to reflect the sample that was inclusive of those who might be disproportionately impacted by the bias of emotion AI. And so to answer our first question, how does the US public conceive of emotion AI? We can see there were a bunch of different answers here that we gave them this selected list, and they could choose which of those they felt reflected how emotion data should be regulated. And I'll go into some of the more popular ones in a moment, but just to pause here to say that the least amount of people felt that emotion AI needed its own regulation or that there was no need for emotion AI policy at all. So the most popular response was that emotion data is like health information. And so in the United States, we have a law called HIPAA, which governs health data privacy. So when thinking about emotion data as health information, we might think of this law. But HIPAA excludes emotion data, which would be used outside of covered healthcare entities. And the way that emotion AI is being used today does fall into these commercial categories that have nothing to do with healthcare using it. So this wouldn't necessarily work. And so the public opinion supports expanding health data protections beyond healthcare, potentially resembling the way that the GDPR in Europe protects physiological data. People also saw emotion data as manipulative. And this reflects Donohue's concept of biomanipulation, which essentially is that people can be manipulated online using their biometric information. And so we reflect on that this would create an autonomy harm, which is a privacy harm that has been identified, in that it would manipulate people into making decisions based on their biometrics that they might not otherwise make. And so this supports a push for the Federal Trade Commission in the United States to expand their current focus on dark patterns to those that might actually result from emotion detection specifically. And then finally, a popular response here was that seeing emotion data as sensitive information. And so the US law does make sensitivity classifications often, but scholarship pushes against saying that data is sensitive and putting it into these sensitivity categories. And so we urge US policymakers to recognize emotion data as personally identifiable, which if released could engender privacy harms, which is the way that we defined sensitive to participants when answering this survey. So next, we looked at how people supported banning emotion AI, and these scores are all out of 7, so you can see that across all of these contexts, support for banning emotion AI was relatively high, the highest being in job interviews in the workplace, and the lowest being in healthcare and border control, but again, relatively high overall. And we find that individuals feel their ownership over their emotion data, and this predicted support for banning emotion AI across most contexts. And so this challenges critiques that have been made around the ability to actually own our data. And it encourages emotion AI regulation to reflect how people feel about that this is their data that they own, and have that in policymaking in reality. We also find that bias and accuracy of emotion AI shape perceptions of emotion AI across all the different contexts. But in reflecting on accuracy, we thought about if accuracy is not necessarily an end goal, or if this should be, or if this is attainable at all. And so we encourage policymakers to consider if emotion AI systems could or should accurately predict human emotions, given the technical critiques against this technology. And then finally, in this model, we find identity matters to perceptions about banning emotion AI. And given time, we can come back to this if anyone has questions. Finally, we asked people who should be held responsible for emotion AI, and asked people to qualitatively give us their responses. The vast majority said the government should be held responsible in the US, but they noted the limitations. One person noting that most people in Congress are out of touch regarding these new emerging technologies. Others noted that the data subjects should be held responsible, so they themselves who the emotion is being collected from. They said that this should only be used with full consent and understanding of all people monitored, if at all. And then finally, some participants mentioned that this should involve a collaborative group of experts, that creators should find out what the people want before connecting with the government, or there should even be a third-party ethics board that should determine how emotion AI companies use this data. And so a few key takeaways that I want to leave you guys with here. One is that emotion AI might not need a new governance framework in the United States. There are a bunch of existing frameworks that we might be able to build on and incorporate in governing this particular type of AI. Second, the US public is generally supportive of banning emotion AI across different contexts of deployment, no matter where it's being deployed. So this is really critical as we continue to potentially support the use of this technology across different sectors. We find people feel emotion data is something that is theirs, that they own, and so this should also be reflected in policy and development. We find identity shapes perceptions about emotion AI regulation, so it matters who this emotion is being collected from in terms of how they might feel about emotion AI being regulated. And finally, while accuracy and bias might be important to people, we encourage policymakers to reflect on if these are realistic for emotion AI, given the critiques. So thank you so much, and happy to answer any questions.